You're probably the most misunderstood person in every room you've ever walked into. And the frustrating part is, you already knew that before you even walked in. That quiet knowing. That thing where you read the energy of a situation before anyone else even notices something is off. That's not anxiety. That's not overthinking. That's actually one of the rarest psychological traits a human being can have. And the world has been punishing you for it your entire life. Let me paint you a picture. It's your early 20s. Your friends are getting promotions, getting engaged, posting about their 5-year plans, and you're sitting there wondering why none of it feels right. Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, but because somewhere deep inside, you can't force yourself to want something that doesn't mean anything. You tried the corporate job, you smiled through the meetings, you said all the right things, but every Sunday night, that dread would come back. Heavy, familiar, like wearing a coat that was made for somebody else. People told you to just push through, that you were being too sensitive, too idealistic, that the real world doesn't work the way you think it does. And maybe, for a while, you believed them. Here's what they didn't tell you. The personality type we're talking about is the INFJ, the rarest one on the Myers-Briggs scale, less than 2% of the entire human population. And what makes this type genuinely different isn't the rare label, honestly, that part gets over-romanticized. What makes it different is the internal architecture. INFJs process the world through a combination of deep intuition and intense emotional attunement. They don't just absorb people, they absorb them. They pick up on the gap between what someone says and what they actually mean. They feel the weight of other people's emotions before those people feel it themselves. That sounds like a superpower. In a lot of ways, it is. But here's the part nobody talks about. That same wiring that makes them perceptive also makes them slower to commit. Because when you can see the full picture, the consequences, the layers, the what ifs, you don't rush. You can't. Your nervous system literally won't let you. And in a world that rewards fast, visible, loud success, that gets mistaken for failure. There's a psychological concept called the late bloomer effect, and researchers have noticed something interesting. The people who succeed significantly later in life, not just financially, but in terms of depth, meaning, and real impact, often share a specific trait. They refused to optimize for the wrong thing early on. Most people in their 20s are optimizing for approval, for external markers, for the version of success that photographs well. And there's nothing wrong with that. It works for a lot of personality types. But INFJs have this stubborn internal compass that rejects that. It's almost involuntary. They'll get 3 years into a successful career and walk away because it didn't feel true. Not because they're flaky, because their system is calibrated to meaning, not metrics. Here's the deeper layer, though. That refusal to fake it, which looks like instability in your 20s, is actually what builds something extraordinary by your 40s. Because while everyone else was collecting titles, you were collecting understanding. You were learning how people work. You were failing in ways that taught you things business school never could. You were sitting with questions most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Now stop for a second and think about your own life. If you're watching this and you're somewhere between 25 and 40 and you feel behind, I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Not to fix it, just to notice it. Where did that feeling come from? Was it yours? Or was it handed to you by someone who was measuring your life against a timeline that was never designed for how your brain works? Because here's something psychologists have observed again and again in people with this profile. They carry enormous amounts of what's called internalized shame, not because they've actually failed by any real standard, but because they spent so many years measuring themselves against a standard that didn't fit them, like grading a fish on its ability to climb a tree and then calling it a failure. That shame goes quiet eventually, but only when you start realizing the timeline you've been using was never yours to begin with. The reason INFJs tend to hit their stride later is actually beautiful once you understand the mechanics of it. They spend years absorbing, processing, failing privately, adjusting. Most people see this period as wasted time, but what's actually happening is something closer to what happens underground before a tree grows tall. You don't see the roots, doesn't mean they're not forming. By the time an INFJ finds their lane, the work that actually aligns with how they think, the relationships that feel genuinely reciprocal, the environment where their depth is an asset instead of an inconvenience, they go fast and they go deep because they've already done the work everyone else still has ahead of them. A friend of mine spent years trying to make it in marketing, hated every second of it. Took a hard left at 34, started writing about human behavior, built a community of people who felt exactly like her, and by 38 had more meaning and income than she'd ever had before. Not because she got lucky, because she finally stopped trying to succeed in someone else's category. That's the pattern, over and over. There's also something worth naming about how INFJs relate to other people, because this is part of why early life feels so hard. They tend to attract emotionally unavailable people, not because they're naive, but because they project depth onto others. They see potential. They can sense what someone could be if they got out of their own way. And sometimes they spend years loving the version of a person that only exists in their own perception. That's painful, really painful. But it also builds an emotional intelligence that is almost unparalleled. The heartbreaks that would make someone else bitter make an INFJ more precise. They get better at reading people, not worse. They get more boundaried, not more closed. They learn slowly, sometimes painfully, to point that depth toward people who actually deserve it. That's a skill you can't teach in a workshop. So what do you actually do with all of this? You stop apologizing for the pace of your own life. That's the practical insight. And I know it sounds simple, but it isn't, because it means actually releasing the comparison, not performatively, not with a gratitude journal, but genuinely deciding that someone else's chapter 2 is not your measuring stick. You look for environments that reward depth over speed. You stop trying to explain yourself to people who aren't wired to understand you and start finding the ones who are. And you trust, not blindly, but based on evidence, that the thing you've been building inside yourself all these years has weight, has value, that it will find its moment. Because it does. Almost always it does. Here's what I'll leave you with. The world spends a lot of energy celebrating people who figured it out early. The prodigies, the 30 under 30 lists, the ones who seem to have it together while the rest of us were still confused. But there's a quieter kind of success. The kind that comes from years of getting it wrong, sitting with the discomfort, refusing to sell out for the easy version of a life. It doesn't make headlines in your 20s. It doesn't photograph well. But if you're the person I've been talking to this whole time, the one who feels things deeply, who's been told you're too much and not enough at the same time, who keeps choosing meaning over convenience even when it costs you, you're not behind. You're just building something that actually lasts. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe. It helps more people like you find content like this. There are more people out there who feel exactly the way you do, and they're waiting to find you too.